The year is 1064. The sands of Jerusalem lie beneath a pitiless sun, their heat shimmering like molten glass. To the east, the desert stretches in endless ripples of ochre, broken only by the ruins of ancient fortresses that have already outlived empires. And in this desolate land, a story is about to be carved into legend. A story that defies every principle of reason, of numbers, of military logic. 800 men, hardened by cold seas and endless battlefields of the north, are about to stand against an army 40 times their size. What took place here would not only stain the desert red with blood, it would forever alter how the world understood faith, power, and the terrifying synergy between the two. But this tale does not begin under Jerusalem's sun. It begins far away across seas whipped by storm, on the misty shores of Norway, a land of pine forests, fjords, and bitter winds. Here, in a kingdom perched at the edge of Christendom, ruled King Magnus Roman III, remembered to history as Magnus Barefoot. His name was more than a curiosity. He was called Barefoot not because of poverty, but for his strange custom of wearing the garments of the Western Isles, short cloaks and bare-legged attire, inspired by his campaigns in Scotland. In a court of fur-lined robes and gilded trappings, this gave him an aura both eccentric and dangerous, a king who cared little for appearances but much for deeds. By Magnus' time, Scandinavia had long since felt the sweep of Christianity. The old gods still lingered in whispers and sagas, but the cross had replaced Thor's hammer on most necks. Yet the Viking spirit had not been extinguished, not entirely. It simmered beneath the surface, restless, waiting. Where once longships set sail for silver and conquest, now they would sail for something even more absolute: holy war. Christianity had not crushed the Viking impulse. It had fused with it, forging something far more volatile. From this collision of faith and ferocity emerged a new kind of warrior, one who could fight with the berserker's frenzy, but cloak it in the righteousness of divine purpose. The spark came from Rome itself. Pope Alexander Roman II had called for the faithful to defend Christendom's sacred lands. Many European nobles saw this summons as political opportunity, a chance to seize wealth or favor under the banner of holy purpose. But Magnus saw something else. He saw the chance to bind his people's ancient warrior ethos to the might of God. His vision was startlingly simple and frightening: to send forth not soldiers of fortune, but instruments of heaven. He would not march to the Holy Land as a conqueror, nor as a mercenary. He would march as the blade of divine will, sharpened by Viking blood. Imagine the chill of a Norwegian dawn when Magnus announced his intent. Warriors who had fought in ceaseless skirmishes between petty Nordic kings now heard of a mission that transcended all local feuds. No longer would their axes swing only for land, treasure, or vengeance. They would strike in God's name, their souls redeemed with each enemy slain. For men who had lived in the shadows of sagas, whose ancestors had spoken of Valhalla, this promise was irresistible. For the first time, paradise itself was not merely a hall of feasting with Odin. It was eternal salvation, a heavenly certainty, purchased through blood. This was the seed from which the 800 were chosen, and though their story would climax beneath the merciless heat of the Jerusalem desert, it is here, in the mist and smoke of the north, that the legend of Magnus Barefoot's holy army began. Magnus Barefoot was not merely a king, he was a paradox. On one hand, he was heir to Norway's royal line, a Christian monarch anointed in the sight of priests and bishops. On the other, he carried within him the spirit of the sea raiders who had terrorized Europe for centuries. To understand the legend that was about to unfold, you must first understand this man, half sovereign, half warrior, and wholly driven by a vision greater than his throne. Magnus' reputation stretched across the northern world. In the sagas, he is described as bold to the point of recklessness, a king who preferred the clang of steel to the politics of court. His campaigns in the Scottish Isles, in Ireland, and along Britain's rugged coasts had already cemented his fame. It was there that he earned his epithet barefoot, when he abandoned heavy northern garments in favor of the shorter, freer attire of the Gaels. To his warriors, this was not mere eccentricity but a symbol. Their king was unbound, unpretentious, and closer to the earth than the gilded rulers of the continent. He fought as they fought, dressed as they dressed, and bled as they bled. Yet beneath this almost savage exterior lay a calculating mind. Magnus understood something his rivals did not, that the old Viking way, built on raiding and plunder, was dying. Europe was hardening. Coastal towns had fortified. Armies had professionalized. What had once been easy targets for longships were now defended with stone walls and steel discipline. If the Norsemen were to continue being feared, their cause would have to be more than silver. It had to be eternal. The timing was perfect. Pope Alexander Roman II, the voice of Rome, had called upon Christendom to defend its sacred places. To the noble courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, this was yet another summons for crusade, one of many. To Magnus, it was revelation. Where others saw politics, he saw destiny. If Viking steel could be married to Christian righteousness, his warriors would no longer be outlaws in the eyes of Europe. They would be champions of God. This vision gave Magnus the moral authority to do what no Norwegian king before him had dared. He began to speak of holy warriors, men who would not sail south as marauders, but as instruments of divine wrath. It was a dangerous blend. Christianity offered salvation. Viking bloodlust offered terror. Together, they created a force that could strike not only at bodies, but at souls. And so Magnus proclaimed his intent: to raise an elite host, not of ordinary fighters, but of men who embodied both traditions. They would pray with the devotion of monks and fight with the ferocity of berserkers. Their weapons would be consecrated in the name of Christ, but their arms would swing with the relentless fury of Odin's children. This dual identity, pagan ferocity baptized in Christian faith, was what made the vision so terrifying and so irresistible. The response was immediate. Across Norway and its scattered isles, whispers spread of the king's holy mission. Old warriors who had grown weary of feuds between jarls saw in this call the chance to give their lives meaning beyond land and gold. Young men, hungry for glory, imagined their names carried in songs not just at home, but across the world. And all of them heard the promise repeated in every sermon, that to die in this holy struggle was to walk directly into paradise. Thus began the gathering of Magnus' chosen. From the misty fjords, the storm-beaten islands, and the deep forests came men who would bind their fate to his. They did not yet know that most of them would never return. But in the way of all who seek immortality, they believed it was worth the risk. For what is one short life weighed against eternal glory? The recruitment of Magnus' chosen warriors was not a call for volunteers, it was a crucible. The king was not looking for numbers, he sought purity. the most dangerous mixture of qualities a man could possess: skill, endurance, and unshakable faith. Magnus' messengers carried his summons across Norway, through villages tucked in fjords and settlements scattered on wind-lashed coasts. But not every man who answered would be accepted. Far from it. Those who came to Bergen found themselves confronted with a test more merciless than any battlefield. The trials began with combat. Candidates fought one another with real weapons, not blunted ones, until the weaker man collapsed in blood and exhaustion. Those who survived were then tested for endurance. Long marches over jagged stone barefoot, hours of swimming in glacial waters, days without rest while burdened with armor and shields. The North had always bred tough men, but Magnus demanded more men whose bodies would not break when others would shatter. Yet even this was not enough. A warrior might wield axe and sword with unmatched skill, might endure pain and hardship, but Magnus wanted something deeper, a fire within the soul. Each candidate was brought before priests and monks, questioned, pressed, and prayed over. They were asked not only to swear loyalty to the king, but to God himself. Could they look upon the cross and see not just salvation, but a weapon? Could they believe that dying in Jerusalem would bring not dishonor, but eternal triumph? Those who wavered, even for a heartbeat, were dismissed. The ones who remained began to change. Their days became as much ritual as drill. Each morning began with prayer. Each evening ended with blessing. Weapons were anointed with holy water, shields carved with crosses. Meals were consecrated, victories in sparring attributed to divine providence. Slowly, deliberately, Magnus reshaped their identity. These were no longer ordinary Vikings driven by greed or vengeance. They were becoming holy fanatics, men whose battle frenzy, the berserker Gengar, was no longer tied to Odin or Thor, but to the Christian God. Imagine the sight of them after weeks of this transformation. Rows of scarred warriors kneeling in silence, lips moving in prayer, the glow of candlelight flickering against their axes. Then, in an instant, the quiet shattered as they rose with a unified roar, weapons raised to the heavens. It was not only terrifying to their enemies, it was terrifying to themselves. They had become something new, something neither fully Viking nor fully Christian, but something more dangerous than either. When the final muster was called, only 800 remained. Each man had endured trials that would have broken 100 others. Each carried not only steel in his hands, but fire in his heart. And each was bound by an oath that could not be broken, to fight until death, for God, for Magnus, and for the eternal glory that awaited beyond the grave. The forging of Magnus' holy warriors did not end with recruitment. Passing the trials only opened the door. Beyond it lay months of preparation that blurred the line between training ground and monastery, between battlefield and church. These men were to be transformed, body and soul, into a weapon the world had never seen. The physical regimen was merciless. Day after day, the chosen drilled with sword and axe until their arms shook and their skin split. But Magnus demanded more than individual skill. Vikings were infamous for their wild charges, for fighting as individuals rather than as an army. Magnus sought to break that tradition. Under the guidance of veterans who had once served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, the 800 were taught the discipline of the South. They drilled in shield walls that could bend without breaking, learned to form circles and squares that held against cavalry, practiced coordinated strikes where every blow opened the way for the next. For a people who had glorified personal glory, This unity was a revolution. Yet Magnus knew that steel alone would not decide their fate. He brought monks and warrior priests into the camps, men who had lived lives of prayer and penance but were no strangers to blood. Every morning began with chants and scripture. Every night closed with hymns. The warriors were taught to see their training not merely as exercise but as devotion. Each strike of the sword was prayer. Each drop of sweat was offering. Their weapons were not just tools of war, they were relics, sanctified by blessing. The transformation was unsettling to watch. Here were men who once swore by Odin now chanting the Psalms with equal fervor. Here were berserkers, wild, howling demons of the north, kneeling in silence before a wooden cross. It was as though Magnus had bound two different worlds together by sheer will. And the result was a breed of warrior unlike any Europe had known, disciplined as Byzantines, fierce as Vikings, and driven by a faith that consumed them. At night, around the fires, old sagas of Thor and Ragnarok mingled with sermons of paradise and martyrdom. Some whispered that Magnus was playing a dangerous game, awakening forces that no man could control. But to the warriors themselves, there was no contradiction. They believed that God had chosen them, that their destiny was not to return home with silver, but to fall in some distant land with their names written in both saga and scripture. By the time winter's frost melted into spring, Magnus' army was ready. No longer merely men of the north, they had become something far more formidable, a brotherhood fused by sweat, blood, and prayer. And soon, their king would set them upon the seas, toward a destiny that even they could scarcely imagine. When spring of 1064 finally came, Magnus' fleet pushed out of Bergen's harbor. The longships rocked upon the dark waters of the fjords like restless beasts eager for open seas. Each vessel carried warriors who had been reshaped by fire and prayer, their shields painted with crosses, their weapons gleaming with oil and blessing. The sails filled with northern winds, and the voyage of destiny began. But Magnus had no intention of striking directly at Jerusalem. He knew that his men needed to be tested in fire before they faced the crucible of the Holy Land. Their first destination was the Orkney Islands, those scattered specks of land where Norse lords had long ruled with an iron grip. Here, Magnus recruited hardened mercenaries who had grown used to fighting in the gales of the North Sea, and more importantly, in climates warmer than Norway's chill. These men were not driven by faith as Magnus' chosen were, but by coin. Yet they added numbers and experience to the fleet, swelling its strength. From Orkney, the ships bent southward, slipping past coasts where Norsemen had once come only as raiders. Now they came as holy warriors. The journey carried them to the sun-baked shores of Spain, where they encountered the Muslim forces of Al-Andalus. Here, amid dry plains and fortified towns, they fought their first true tests. The Vikings quickly learned that their foes were unlike the Saxons or Danes they had battled at home. The Saracens were masters of speed and maneuver. Horsemen thundered across the plains with deadly grace, their curved scimitars flashing like silver lightning. Archers loosed storms of arrows with terrifying accuracy. They fought not as fragmented bands, but as coordinated hosts, drilled in tactics honed over centuries of desert and steppe warfare. Yet in these first skirmishes something remarkable happened. Time and again, when it seemed the Norsemen should have faltered under the weight of cavalry charges or arrow fire, they did not break. Instead, they roared, pressed closer, and fought with an intensity their enemies had never seen. The fusion of Viking ferocity with Christian conviction became a weapon in itself. The Saracens, skilled though they were, found themselves facing men who did not fight to live, but to die gloriously. That kind of enemy is the most dangerous of all. Magnus' men began to understand their own transformation. Every clash was a lesson. They learned how to blunt cavalry charges with overlapping shields, how to counter archers by closing distance swiftly, how to use their fanatical cohesion to turn chaos into advantage. By the time they left the Iberian coast behind, they had tasted both victory and blood, and they carried with them a grim confidence that they could face any enemy, no matter how alien. As the year wore on, the fleet pressed further south and east, their prows cutting across the Mediterranean. Salt spray mixed with desert winds, and their sails glowed red in the setting sun. By winter, the Norsemen reached Constantinople, the queen of cities, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. It was here, in that ancient crossroads of east and west, that Magnus would forge the final edge of his sword. Constantinople. To the Norse, it was not just a city. It was a wonder whispered about in sagas, the fabled Miklagarthur, the great city. Its walls rose higher than any fortress in the north, stretching for miles, crowned with towers of stone and bronze. Its harbors brimmed with ships from every corner of the world, bearing spices from Arabia, silks from the east, and treasures beyond imagining. For Magnus warriors, hardened by fjords and forests, to behold the Queen of Cities was to glimpse another world entirely. But this was no sightseeing voyage. Constantinople was the crucible where Magnus' men would be sharpened. For centuries, Norse warriors had served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite unit. Many of these veterans were still in the city, men who had fought under golden banners and returned north with tales of wealth and strange weapons. Through them, Magnus gained access to the Byzantine war machine, smiths who forged armor stronger than anything in Scandinavia, artisans who crafted helms designed to deflect arrows, and strategists who taught tactics unknown to the north. Among the most prized acquisitions was knowledge of a weapon so terrible that its very name carried dread Greek fire. This incendiary mixture, hurled in clay pots or sprayed from siphons, could not be extinguished with water. Once ignited, it clung to skin and armor alike, devouring flesh as though the flame itself were alive. Though the Byzantines guarded its secrets jealously, Magnus' men gleaned enough during their stay to experiment, developing their own crude variant. The knowledge of fire that could eat through an army was a weapon of fear as much as destruction. Magnus also used Constantinople to harden his political alliances. He forged ties with Byzantine commanders eager to see Muslim rivals weaken, and he secured supplies of weapons, armor, and horses. His fleet left the Bosporus not as a band of wandering warriors, but as a force armed with the best the medieval world could provide. For the Vikings, the stay in Byzantium was transformative. They had begun this journey as sons of the north, familiar only with the ways of axe and shield. Now they marched with the discipline of Roman legions, wielding weapons that seemed forged by sorcery, clad in steel that gleamed with imperial brilliance. They were no longer simply raiders. They were becoming an army of crusaders forged in fire, faith, and steel. And when spring broke once more, they turned their sails eastward at last, toward the land that had haunted every prayer and every sermon since they left Norway, Jerusalem. The Holy Land was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach, and word of their approach spread faster than the wind. As Magnus' fleet left the shining domes of Constantinople behind, word of their journey raced ahead of them like wildfire carried on desert winds. Along the caravan routes in marketplaces from Damascus to Cairo, whispers spread of pale-skinned giants sailing south. Some called them Norsemen, others Franks, still others demons from the northern seas. Whatever the name, the rumor was the same. They were not like ordinary crusaders. They were said to fight with a frenzy that defied reason, to laugh at wounds, to welcome death as if it were victory itself. For Muslim commanders, the news was curious but not alarming. After all, what could a few hundred men accomplish against the armies of Islam? When word reached Elamir Abu Nazar, the commander of forces around Jerusalem, he scoffed at the idea that such a paltry band could pose any danger. To him, the Norsemen were an opportunity, not a threat. Crush them swiftly, and he would prove his supremacy to rivals and allies alike. Abu Nazar was no amateur. He had built his reputation in the crucible of Middle Eastern warfare, where strategy was as important as bravery. His host was not merely large, it was immense. 40,000 men answered his summons. Heavy cavalry, their armor gleaming in the sun. Swift horse archers, whose arrows could blacken the sky. Infantry drilled for siege and field alike. Siege engines creaked on wagons, ready to batter walls or scatter formations. His army was a living storm, and he commanded it with absolute confidence. To men like Abu Nazar, warfare was a game of inevitability. Numbers crushed courage, arrows humbled fury, discipline outlasted chaos. Against countless enemies before, this logic had held true. Why should today be any different? The chosen battlefield was the arid plain southeast of Jerusalem, near the ancient fortress of Herodion. There, under a sky as white as molten glass, the stage was set. On one side, endless lines of soldiers unfurled across the horizon, banners snapping in the desert wind, the ground trembling beneath the thunder of hooves and marching feet. On the other side, a compact square of 800 Norsemen, their shields polished like mirrors beneath the sun, their axes steady in calloused hands. The contrast was staggering. To the Saracen soldiers, it must have seemed absurd, a mere speck of defiance facing a sea of steel. Yet the Vikings stood unmoving, silent, as though carved from stone. Abu Nazar's men expected fear, hesitation, perhaps even surrender. Instead, they faced stillness. Not weakness, but readiness. What Abu Nazar did not yet know was that Magnus had anticipated this very moment. The months of preparation, the drills under Byzantine mercenaries, the prayers with warrior priests, all had been building to this. The Vikings were not planning to survive this day. They were planning to die, but to die in such a way that their deaths would echo through generations. As dawn spread its fire across the desert, both armies prepared to write their names into history. One side marched with numbers, banners, and confidence. The other stood with faith, steel, and the fury of men who had already accepted their graves. The desert wind held its breath. The storm was about to break. The two armies faced one another across the plain like opposing worlds. For Abu Nazar, the battle plan was simple, a masterpiece of numbers and inevitability. He had seen it work a dozen times before. His cavalry would surround the enemy completely, cutting off all hope of retreat. His mounted archers would rain down death from afar, softening the enemy ranks. Then, at the moment of weakness, his infantry would advance in a wave so vast it would smother resistance like the tide swallowing footprints in the sand. Why should today be any different? The strategy had broken countless armies larger and better equipped than this pitiful band of northerners. Abu Nasr looked upon Magnus' 800 men as one might look upon a cornered animal, dangerous only for a moment, before it was crushed beneath the boot of inevitability. But Magnus and his commanders had anticipated every detail of this approach. They had studied Saracen tactics during their long months of travel, from Spain's plains to Byzantine manuals, even from the lips of captured enemies. They knew that Muslim cavalry relied on space to maneuver, on speed to overwhelm, on archery to wear down discipline. And so the Vikings had forged a plan not to resist death, but to embrace it. To Abu Nasr's men, they must have appeared suicidal. 800 against 40,000, surely no one could expect to win. But that was the secret. The Vikings did not intend to win by survival. They intended to win by martyrdom, to carve so deep a wound into their enemy that it would fester in memory long after their own bones bleached in the desert. The morning air trembled with tension. Saracen war horns blared across the plains, their echoes rolling like thunder over stone. Drums pounded in unison, the sound of an empire's heartbeat. The cavalry shifted impatiently, horses stamping the sand, nostrils flaring in the rising heat. The banners of Islam rippled in the wind, their bright colors a forest of defiance against the pale northern square. And opposite them the Vikings waited. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked so tightly they gleamed like a wall of iron. Their eyes were hard, unblinking, their breath slow and measured. Some murmured prayers, others whispered sagas. There was no panic in their ranks, no tremor of fear. To an outside observer, it may have seemed eerie, this silence facing such overwhelming force. But within that silence lay something more terrifying than any battle cry: absolute resolve. At dawn's first blaze, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Then came the first movement, the cavalry, thousands of horsemen, surging forward in a roar of hooves and steel. Dust rose in a great storm behind them, a wall of sand that threatened to swallow the Vikings whole. Abu Nasr's plan had begun. What neither he nor his men yet realized was that Magnus had no intention of meeting that storm head-on. The trap was about to be sprung. The earth shook beneath the charge of thousands of horses. The sound was like thunder rolling across the desert, hooves drumming in rhythm with the blare of Saracen horns. Dust rose in towering clouds, veiling the sun, and through it the cavalry appeared as a black tide surging forward, scimitars flashing in arcs of silver. To any ordinary army, this was the end. No line could withstand such force. No shield wall could endure the storm that was about to break upon it. But the Vikings did not hold their ground. They did something utterly unthinkable. As the cavalry thundered closer, the compact block of 800 men suddenly fractured. At Magnus' command, the square dissolved into 8 circles of 100 warriors each, spaced apart across the plain. To an enemy's eyes, it looked like chaos, like the Norsemen had broken in fear. The horsemen roared with triumph and drove straight into the gaps. That was the mistake. The wheel of death, as it would later be remembered, had been perfected during long months of training. Each circle locked shields outward, forming a living fortress. As the cavalry swept between them thinking to break the line, the circles closed ranks behind, trapping riders in confined spaces. Horses panicked, pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to wheel or charge. And in those choking gaps, the Vikings struck. Axes bit into armor, splitting riders from saddle. Spears with cruel hooks dragged horsemen to the ground. Swords flashed in brutal arcs, cutting through flesh and leather. It was a slaughterhouse, hidden within rings of steel. The first wave of cavalry, men who had expected an effortless victory, found themselves butchered in seconds. What made it worse was the way the Vikings fought. They did not lash out wildly as the Saracens expected. Every movement was precise, every strike supported by another. One warrior's shield opened space for his brother's axe. A spear thrust forced an enemy back into the swing of a sword. It was not chaos, but choreography, a deadly rhythm drilled into their bones. And then came the terror beyond tactics, the frenzy. The Vikings entered what their ancestors had called berserker ganger, the battle trance. But now it was sanctified, sharpened by faith. They fought as if they were no longer men, but something between angels and demons. Wounds that would cripple another soldier only drove them further. An arrow in the shoulder, a cut to the face, none of it mattered. Their eyes were wild, their cries thundered like storms, and every death they dealt was offered to God as a prayer in steel and blood. For the Saracen horsemen, the shock was unbearable. They had faced brave men before, but never this. Never soldiers who welcomed death, who seemed to grow stronger as their comrades fell, who fought not for survival but for transcendence. Panic rippled through the cavalry ranks. Some turned their mounts, trying to escape the circles, only to be cut down from behind. Others pressed forward blindly, slamming into their own comrades. In moments, the desert plain became a charnel pit. Watching from a distance, Abu Nasr frowned. The opening strike, meant to break the Norsemen instantly, had failed. Worse, his men were reeling, confused, and bloodied. But he was not yet concerned. Perhaps 1,000 dead, nothing compared to the size of his army. He would adapt. He had other tactics. What he did not understand, not yet, was that he was no longer facing an army of men. He was facing an army of martyrs, each one determined to drag as many foes as possible into death beside him. The storm had only just begun. The first wave of cavalry had been swallowed whole by the wheel of death, leaving the plain littered with bodies and broken horses. The survivors pulled back in chaos, dust and blood mingling in the wind. Abu Nasr, watching from his command post on a ridge, narrowed his eyes. These northerners were not ordinary foes, but he still believed he had the answer. He signaled for the mounted archers. The horsemen rode forward in disciplined lines, bows raised, their quivers heavy with arrows. This was a strategy honed by centuries of warfare across steppe and desert. Do not meet ferocity head-on, but bleed it dry from a distance. The plan was simple: circle the Viking formations and unleash a storm of shafts until even the most stubborn fanatic crumbled under the weight of wounds. At his order, the sky darkened. Arrows hissed through the air in black swarms, falling upon the Norse circles with a sound like rain hammering a roof. Horses screamed, men staggered, shields rang with constant impact. From a distance, it must have looked like the Vikings had been buried alive under a living storm. But Magnus had foreseen this too. During the night before battle, his men had dragged timbers, scraps of leather, and even the bodies of the fallen into makeshift ramparts. Shields were stacked to form low walls, braced with spears and weighted with sand. Beneath these improvised fortifications, the Norse huddled together, their discipline unbroken. They prayed. They murmured hymns, they endured. To the archers circling above, it seemed as if the northerners had become an immovable island in a sea of arrows. When the storm slackened, the counterattack came. Suddenly, the shield walls parted and out flew weapons the Saracens had never seen before. Axes with crescent blades designed to pierce armor. Spears tipped with iron hooks that dragged riders screaming from their saddles. And most horrifying of all, clay pots filled with a foul-smelling liquid, a crude cousin of Byzantine Greek fire. When those pots shattered among the horsemen, the desert erupted into nightmare. Flames clung to clothes and armor, refusing to die even as men rolled on the ground or tried to smother them with sand. Horses bolted in terror, trampling their own riders. The air filled with shrieks, not the cries of men dying cleanly by sword, but the agony of being devoured alive by fire. Saracen chroniclers who later described this moment spoke of it in apocalyptic tones. They wrote that the air itself seemed to burn, that the Vikings fought as though they commanded the infernos of hell. To soldiers who had expected their arrows to break enemy resolve, the sight was incomprehensible. Instead of retreating, the northerners surged outward, faces streaked with soot and blood, their voices rising in guttural chants. Every arrow that struck them only seemed to confirm their faith. Every wound became proof that they were chosen. And as they cut through the mounted archers with relentless fury, their enemies began to sense a truth more dangerous than any weapon. These men could not be broken. The desert plain, once so carefully prepared for victory, was already beginning to tilt toward nightmare. Abu Nazar's strategy had cracked, but still he did not panic. His cavalry had failed. His archers had failed. But he had not yet unleashed the full weight of his army. What he did not yet grasp was that the Vikings had only just begun to reveal their deadliest secret. The plain lay in ruin from the first two assaults. Dead horses smoldered in the sand, arrows jutted like black thorns from shields and corpses, and the stench of burning flesh carried on the desert wind. The Saracens had thrown cavalry and archers at the northerners, and both had been repelled with losses that gnawed at confidence. Abu Nazar, though, was not finished. He believed in the simplest truth of war: numbers. No matter how fanatical the enemy, no matter how disciplined, 800 men could not endure the weight of 20,000 infantry pressing from every side. He ordered the advance. The ground trembled as wave after wave of foot soldiers moved forward. Spears bristled like a forest of iron. Shields overlapped into walls of wood and leather. The desert sun blazed directly overhead, baking men inside their armor until sweat streamed into their eyes. But the Saracen host moved as one, a human tide. Against such weight, any ordinary force would be buried. Magnus' men waited. From their circles they could hear the rhythmic roar of thousands chanting prayers to Allah, feel the heat of bodies pushing closer. Some closed their eyes, whispering psalms. Others bit down on their shields until their teeth bled. They were not afraid, not anymore. They had been saving something for this moment. When the enemy pressed within 50 meters, Magnus gave the order. The Vikings lifted clay pots that had been guarded like treasure since Constantinople. With practiced precision, they hurled them into the advancing masses. The desert ignited. What the Saracens saw was not ordinary fire. This flame clung like liquid, spread with the wind, and screamed when it touched flesh. Shields went up in an instant, but the fire poured down their fronts, eating through wood and leather. Armor heated until men cooked inside it. Lines of soldiers broke apart as panic surged through them, not from wounds of steel but from the terror of being consumed alive. From within their rings, the Vikings roared and burst forward. Their war cries were no longer merely human. They were primal, guttural, echoing like the voices of an older age. Some were already aflame themselves, their tunics and hair burning, yet still they charged, swinging axes that dripped both blood and fire. To their enemies, it was as if the gates of hell had opened and disgorged demons in human form. The battlefield turned into chaos. Men trampled their own comrades in desperate flight. Others dropped weapons and fled through the fire, only to fall to Viking blades waiting beyond the flames. The desert, once so still and vast, now seethed like a living inferno. Muslim chroniclers who later wrote of this moment spoke of it with dread. They did not call it a battle. They called it a vision of Judgment Day, because what they saw was not soldiers holding ground. They saw men who fought as if death itself was their weapon, men who burned and still advanced, who screamed prayers through mouths blackened with smoke. Abu Nazar, from his vantage point, felt the first tremor of something unfamiliar, doubt. His army was vast, his soldiers disciplined, his tactics proven. And yet, against these 800, nothing had worked as expected. He realized with a sinking certainty that he was not fighting ordinary men at all. He was fighting men who believed they were already dead. And that kind of enemy could not be broken by numbers alone. The battlefield now resembled a nightmare. Fire raged in scattered pockets across the sand. Thousands of Saracen soldiers lay broken, trampled, or charred, their cries mingling with the guttural chants of the Norsemen who still fought as if untouched by mortality. Abu Nazar, watching the slaughter from his command ridge, knew he had underestimated these men. They were not merely resisting. They were devouring his army piece by piece, so he resolved to end the madness by cutting off its head. If the rank and file could not break the Northerners, perhaps his elite could. With a gesture, he summoned his personal guard, 2,000 warriors who were the pride of his command. They were veterans of countless campaigns, men hardened by wars against Byzantines, crusaders, and rival emirs. Each bore scars of survival. Each rode horses bred for endurance and speed. This was no rabble. This was the steel heart of Abu Nazar's power. Their task was simple: kill Magnus, shatter the symbol, and the spirit of the enemy would collapse. The clash was apocalyptic. Across the battlefield, the Viking circles opened, and Magnus stepped forward with his chosen elite, men handpicked for their ferocity and loyalty. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered, his presence unmistakable even from afar. In his hands he carried a massive double-headed axe, said by his priests to have been blessed with holy water, a weapon that gleamed red as if it thirsted for blood. To his warriors, he was no longer merely their king. He was the living vessel of God's wrath. The two forces met like storms colliding. For an hour, the desert was filled with the deafening clang of steel, the neigh of dying horses, and the guttural roars of men fighting as though the world itself depended on their blows. The Saracen guard fought with precision, their curved blades flashing in deadly arcs, their shields rising in unison. The Vikings met them with raw power. Every strike of their axes meant to split both shield and man. At the heart of this chaos, Magnus and Abu Nazar finally faced one another. The emir was no distant commander. He was a warrior scholar trained in Damascus, his swordsmanship refined by years of dueling. He moved with practiced grace, his blade cutting through the air like water. Against a lesser foe, his speed and skill would have been overwhelming. But Magnus fought like no ordinary man. He was taller, heavier, and each swing of his axe was like a hammer blow. He did not fight with finesse, he fought with inevitability. And more terrifying still, he fought with conviction, every strike accompanied by the unshakable belief that God guided his hands. To Abu Nazar, it was like dueling a storm. The duel raged, sparks leaping from clashing steel, both men circling in the dust. For a moment it seemed as though the emir's precision might hold. His blade nicked Magnus' arm, cut shallow lines across his mail. But conviction outlasted skill. At last, Magnus brought his axe down in a brutal arc that shattered Abu Nazar's defense and cleaved through him with finality. The emir fell, his blood soaking into the sand. And in that instant, it was not just a man who died. It was the will of an entire army. From the ridge to the farthest edge of the battlefield, Saracen soldiers saw their commander fall. Shock rippled outward like a tidal wave. Men who had begun the day with unshakable confidence now stared in disbelief. Could these pale northerners truly be unstoppable? Was their God stronger, their faith sharper than steel? The thought spread faster than fire, and with it came terror. The great host that had once seemed invincible began to waver. And once the cracks appeared, collapse was inevitable. The fall of Abu Nazar was like a blade driven into the heart of his army. What began as murmurs of disbelief swelled into a tide of panic. Soldiers who had marched with confidence now felt the ground vanish beneath them. The sight of their commander's lifeless body sprawled in the dust, cut down by the northern giant, was more than a defeat. It was a sign, a terrifying omen. The host of 40,000 began to unravel. Lines of infantry broke into confusion. Cavalrymen pulled at their reins, desperate to escape the inferno of smoke and steel. Officers shouted orders, but their voices were drowned beneath the roar of terror. Men who had faced Byzantines and Crusaders, men who had once believed themselves invincible, now fled as though demons pursued them. Magnus saw it happen. From the chaos of the duel he rose, his axe slick with blood, his face blackened by smoke, his eyes wild with conviction. He understood in that moment that victory was not enough. Terror itself was now his greatest weapon. He raised his voice above the din, bellowing a single command: no survivors. It was not strategy, it was extermination. The Vikings surged forward like a flood of steel. Their circles broke apart into hunting packs, each band of warriors chasing fragments of the shattered army. What followed was not a battle but a rout, and then something darker. Across the burning desert, the Norsemen pursued their prey. Fleeing Saracens were cut down on the run, trampled beneath hooves, or dragged screaming into the dust. Officers who tried to rally their men were struck down by their own panicked soldiers. Order dissolved completely, replaced by chaos and blood. For 3 days the slaughter did not end. The Vikings chased fugitives across dunes and through rocky passes, using ambushes and traps as if the desert itself obeyed their will. They severed escape routes, surrounded stragglers, and annihilated any cluster of survivors. But this was no ordinary killing. It became ritual. Each execution was performed with prayers whispered over the fallen. Every life taken was justified as God's work. To the Vikings, this was not cruelty but devotion, a sacred harvest of souls offered up to the divine. Death had ceased to be a grim necessity of war. It had become liturgy, a sacrament written in steel and blood. By the time the desert winds finally stilled, The numbers were staggering. More than 35,000 Saracens lay dead, their bodies strewn across miles of sand. The plain that had once been a battlefield had become a graveyard. Of Magnus' 800 warriors, only 230 had fallen. A terrible loss, yes, but nothing compared to the impossible odds they had faced. And in the silence that followed, the world was forced to reckon with what had happened. That a tiny band of northern fanatics had annihilated one of the strongest armies in the Holy Land. When the fires died and the screams faded, the desert was left in silence, broken only by the carrion birds circling overhead. What Magnus and his warriors had achieved seemed impossible, almost supernatural. And as news spread, it became larger than fact. It became legend. Across the Muslim world, the shock was immediate. In Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, the story raced ahead of messengers that an army of 40,000 had been obliterated by 800 fanatics from the north. At first, rulers dismissed it as rumor, exaggeration carried by fleeing soldiers. But when survivors stumbled into cities burned, broken, and raving about northern demons who did not die, disbelief gave way to fear. If such men could annihilate one of the strongest regional hosts, what could they do next? For Magnus, the aftermath was a weapon. He wasted no time in harnessing terror. Local Christian communities, long oppressed and scattered, rallied to his side. To them, these Norse warriors were not just men but avengers sent by heaven. Within weeks, his host swelled from hundreds to thousands, not mercenaries, but believers, each eager to follow men who had already proven God's favor on the battlefield. Cities that had resisted sieges for years now opened their gates at the mere rumor of the Vikings' approach. Garrisons surrendered without a fight. Peasants fled before their shadows. The desert wind carried their name like a curse. The Vikings did not even need to swing their axes. Their reputation did it for them. And in Europe, the legend grew even greater. Stories reached the courts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Rome itself. Chroniclers seized upon the miracle, 800 defeating 40,000. They embroidered it, shaping it into proof of divine providence. Some claimed angels had fought beside the Norsemen. Others wrote that arrows could not pierce their consecrated armor, that their weapons glowed with holy light. Whether these details were believed or not did not matter. What mattered was the effect. The massacre near Jerusalem became a rallying cry. For knights and nobles who hesitated at the idea of journeying east, the tale was irresistible. If a handful of northern fanatics could shatter such a force, imagine what thousands of Christian warriors might achieve. Fear, faith, and ambition mingled into a single irresistible current that would soon surge into history as the Crusades. But even as the story inspired awe in Europe, it left scars in the lands of Islam. The survivors carried not only memories of slaughter but visions of terror. They spoke of men who fought while aflame, of warriors who smiled through wounds, of leaders who struck like giants. These tales spread just as quickly as in Europe, but here they did not inspire, they haunted. Commanders began to whisper that no number was safe against such zeal. The shadow of the massacre stretched across the desert, long and dark. Magnus had won more than a battle. He had weaponized legend itself. The echoes of Magnus' slaughter did not fade with the desert winds. They carried across continents, reshaping faith, war, and memory alike. When Pope Urban Roman II prepared his call for the First Crusade decades later, the story of 800 northern warriors defeating 40,000 Saracens became the ultimate proof that God's hand rested upon Christian arms. Chroniclers repeated the tale with feverish devotion. Some claimed angels had descended to fight beside the Norsemen. Others wrote that Magnus' axe glowed like a fragment of the sun, splitting men as if by divine fire. Myth and fact blurred until the legend itself became a weapon sharper than steel. But the legacy was not only one of inspiration, it was also one of justification. Magnus' campaign established a precedent that would haunt centuries to come. The idea that holy war permitted no limits, no mercy, no survivors. The Vikings had shown that extermination could be sanctified, that terror could be wielded as readily as sword and shield. Later crusaders copied their methods: fire, ritual killings, the relentless pursuit of broken enemies. What had begun as a singular expedition was reborn again and again in orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, each claiming to merge devotion with discipline, faith with ferocity. Magnus himself did not live to see the long shadow of his actions. In 1069, he was cut down in battle near Antioch, a warrior to the end. Yet even in death, his legend grew. Songs celebrated him as both king and martyr. Churches were built in his honor. Warriors invoked his name before battle, as though calling upon his spirit could bring divine favor. The few survivors who returned north carried stories that ignited a new generation. Young men raised on these tales would march east in later crusades, believing themselves heirs to Magnus' holy fury. And yet, behind the glory lay something darker. The Massacre revealed the terrible truth of conviction. That belief itself can be more dangerous than numbers, weapons, or fortifications. Magnus' men triumphed not merely because of their tactics or their armor, but because they believed with every fiber of their being that God had chosen them. That certainty made them fearless. That certainty made them merciless. It forces us, even 1,000 years later, to wrestle with a haunting question. Was their devotion admirable or monstrous? Perhaps it was both. For what took place in that desert was not simply a military victory. It was a revelation of what humanity is capable of when faith becomes fire. Courage and loyalty, sacrifice and ferocity, all gleamed bright in those 800 men. But so too did cruelty, fanaticism, and destruction. The massacre near Jerusalem endures because it was more than a clash of armies. It was a moment when faith itself became a weapon, a force that could move not only mountains, but empires. It is a warning of the horrors that absolute conviction can unleash, and a reminder of the extraordinary heights and depths that human beings can reach when united by belief. Magnus Barefoot and his 800 remind us that the limits of possibility are not always physical. They are in the mind, in what men dare to believe is possible. Sometimes that belief builds wonders. Sometimes it burns the world.